Take this. Can you be my mom just for tonight?" The boy's hand was trembling, not from Boston's bitter cold biting into his cheeks, but from the terror of hearing a rejection. The crumpled $100 bill floated between his gloved fingers like a desperate offering. Harper Sullivan felt her heart stop. She'd witnessed many things in her 27 years of life. She'd buried her parents and baby sister in the same week, watched their house burn to ashes while she worked a night shift at a convenience store, survived 2 suicide attempts, and crossed the country to care for her dying grandmother. But never had she seen such concentrated loneliness in a child's eyes. "What's your name?" she whispered, ignoring the money. Matteo Castellano." The name sent ice through her veins. Castellano. The crime family that controlled Boston's underworld, whose name was whispered in fear across every dark alley and police precinct. And yet the heir to that bloody empire was standing here, nose red from the cold, eyes brimming with tears, offering $100 to a stranger. "Matteo," Harper repeated softly. "Where's your family?" The boy pointed vaguely toward the Ritz-Carlton, where black SUVs lined the entrance like sleeping predators. "Dad's at his meeting. He's always at meetings. People always die after his meetings." Harper looked down at the basket of paper flowers at her feet, delicate roses and lilies she crafted to pay for her grandmother's dialysis. On a good day, she made maybe $40, and this child was offering her $100 for something priceless. "Put your money away, sweetheart." Matteo's eyes flooded with tears. "So you don't want to?" "I didn't say that." Harper shifted to make room on the bench. Snow crunched beneath her worn boots. She patted the seat beside her. "Come here, sit with me." Matteo obeyed as if he'd just been given permission to breathe. He sat so close, their shoulders touched. Harper felt his small body shaking, and without thinking, she unwrapped her scarf and wound it around the boy's neck. "Are you hungry?" "A little." From her bag, she pulled out a thermos of hot chocolate she'd made that morning to survive the hours in the park. "Careful, it's still hot." Matteo took a sip and closed his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. "Mom used to make chocolate like this," he murmured, before the bad men took her to heaven. Harper's chest constricted painfully. 3 years. This child had been without a mother for 3 years, surrounded by blood money but empty of love. "You miss her a lot, don't you?" "Every day. Dad never talks about her. He says it hurts too much. He says he'll kill everyone who took her, but he still can't bring her back. Sometimes adults don't know how to face pain, sweetheart. We hide it because we're scared." Matteo looked at her with eyes too old for 8 years. "You don't hide anything. I can see it in your eyes. You're broken too." Harper smiled sadly. "Maybe that's why I'm sitting here selling paper flowers in the snow. You don't have a home. I do. A small one with my grandma who's very sick. But I need money for her medicine. Then take the $100, please." "Matteo." The voice cut through the air like a blade. Harper shot to her feet instinctively, heart pounding. 4 black SUVs screeched to a halt at the park's edge. Men in dark suits emerged first, hands inside their jackets, eyes scanning for threats. Then he appeared. A tall man crossing the park with furious strides, his presence parting the falling snow like a dark god descending. Cashmere coat worth more than her yearly income, jaw clenched tight, eyes that had ordered deaths burning with rage. A scar ran down his left jaw, a reminder that even kings bleed. Marco Castellano seized his son's arm. "What the hell are you doing here? I told you never to leave the hotel without security." "Dad," she. But Marco had already turned to look at Harper. His gray eyes swept over her from head to toe. The worn boots, the patched coat, the basket of paper flowers. His expression hardened into something lethal. "Who are you?" he growled. "And what do you want with my son? If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in unexpected love. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss what happens next. Because what Marco Castellano doesn't know yet is that this broken woman sitting in the snow will soon bring his empire to its knees, not with bullets, but with something far more dangerous. Harper didn't step back even once. She'd seen too much darkness in her life to be frightened by a man in a cashmere coat. Who was she? She was the only person who'd sat beside his son while he was off somewhere counting bodies. The air froze. The guards behind Marco turned to stone, no one daring to breathe too loudly. No one spoke to Castellano like that and lived to tell the story. But Harper Sullivan didn't know that. Or maybe she did, and didn't care. She'd lost everything 9 years earlier. What was left to lose now? Marco Castellano felt rage flare in his chest. but something else slipped in alongside it. Surprise. Curiosity. This woman's eyes didn't tremble. They looked straight at him as if he were just an ordinary man, and not someone who held the lives of an entire city in his hands. She dared. I dare because your son's shaking alone in the snow and nobody came looking for him. Harper stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She was nearly a head shorter than him, but her presence wasn't small. An 8-year-old boy sitting alone in a park at night, offering money to strangers for a little kindness. What do you think that says about you, Mr. Castellano? Marco clenched his jaw. She didn't know who she was talking to. I know exactly who I'm talking to, Harper replied coolly. All of Boston knows who you are. The question is whether you know who your son is. Matteo tugged at his father's sleeve. Dad, don't do anything to her. She was good to me. She gave me chocolate. She sat with me. Be quiet, Matteo. No. For the first time in 3 years, the 8-year-old shouted at his father. You always tell me to be quiet. You're always busy. You always have something more important than me. She's the first person who looked at me like I was real. Marco felt as if he'd been slapped. His son's words drove into his chest harder than any bullet he'd ever taken. He looked down at Matteo, at the reddened eyes, at the unfamiliar scarf wrapped around the boy's neck, at the $100 bill still clutched in his hand. Then he looked back at the woman. She stood there in scuffed boots, a patched coat, a basket of paper flowers as if it were her only possession in the world. Yet she held herself straight, as though she were the one with power here. Tony, Marco said without turning. A large man stepped forward at once. Yes, sir. Take Matteo to the car. Matteo began to cry. No, Dad. I want to stay with. Get in the car. Now. Marco's voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp as a blade. The boy trembled, looking at Harper one last time with desperate eyes. Harper bent to his level, her voice gentle. Go with your father, sweetheart. Everything's going to be all right. Matteo shook his head, tears streaming. I'm never going to see you again. You don't know that. Harper gave a small smile. But remember this. Hot chocolate will always be here if you need it. Tony guided Matteo away carefully, the boy glancing back until Harper disappeared behind the curtain of snow. Marco remained where he was, watching the woman in front of him. She didn't show fear, didn't plead, didn't explain. She just stood there as if waiting for him to make his next move. Where do you live? None of your business. I'll find out anyway. Harper shrugged. Then why ask? She turned her back, sat down on the bench, and went on arranging her paper flowers as though the most powerful mafia boss in Boston didn't exist. Marco stayed there a few seconds longer, unaccustomed to being dismissed. At last he turned and walked away, then stopped after a few steps. Follow her, he told the 2 remaining guards. I want to know who she is, where she lives, what she does. Everything. The men nodded and melted into the shadows. Marco climbed into the car, where Matteo was curled up in the back seat, clutching the $100 bill like treasure. The black Mercedes slid through the snowy night. Harper watched until the taillights vanished. Then she looked down at her basket. Matteo's $100 bill lay tucked among the paper roses. The boy must have slipped it in at some point. Harper picked it up and stared at it for a long time. $100. Enough to pay for 3 days of dialysis for the old woman. Enough to buy food for the whole week. Enough to survive a little longer. But she set it back down neatly beside the flowers. She couldn't take money from a child who was searching for kindness. No matter how badly she needed it, the snow kept falling. Harper sat alone on the bench, the scarf no longer warming her neck, but her heart warmer than it had been in years, because for the first time in 9 years, she felt that she mattered to someone, even if that someone was only an 8-year-old boy with eyes far too sad for his age. 3 days later, Tony Russo laid a brown folder on Marco's desk. It wasn't thick, but it was heavy enough to destroy everything Marco thought he knew. Harper Sullivan, 27 years old, born in Portland, Maine. Father a mechanic, mother a nurse, 1 younger sister named Lily, 3 years behind her. An ordinary family, an ordinary life, until the night of December 12th, 9 years earlier. Marco turned the next page and felt the blood in his veins freeze. The Sullivan house fire. 3 dead. Official cause, electrical malfunction. But Tony had dug deeper. That night, the Sullivan family accidentally witnessed a hit in the parking lot behind a church. 2 days later, their house went up in flames at 2 a.m. The doors were locked from the outside. No one got out, except Harper, who'd been working the night shift at a convenience store 5 miles away. Marco stared at the final line of the report and felt like he'd been punched in the gut. Suspected perpetrators. The Vasquez gang. Vasquez. The name rang through Marco's mind like a funeral bell. The Vasquez family had been the Castellanos' sworn enemies for 2 decades. How many lives had that war taken? Including Gianna, his wife. And now he discovered that the same war had also taken the family of the woman in the park that night. Harper Sullivan came home at 6 in the morning at 18 years old and found nothing but ashes. She buried her parents and her sister in the same week. No relatives, no money, nothing but the convenience store uniform on her back. The report showed 2 psychiatric hospitalizations in the first year, 2 failed suicide attempts. Scars on her wrists. Marco closed his eyes. He'd seen death. He'd ordered killings. He'd watched blood spill without his hand shaking. But this was the first time he felt real guilt settle on his chest. She was collateral damage, Tony said quietly. Secondary losses in our war with Vasquez. Her family was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marco opened his eyes and stared at the photo in the folder. Harper Sullivan at 18, hair in a ponytail, smiling brightly beside her family in a Christmas picture. Next to it was a recent surveillance photo, taken from afar, her sitting on a park bench with eyes that had partly died. 9 years. 9 years living with pain his war had caused. And 3 nights ago, his son had held out $100 to her, begging for a little kindness from the woman his world had destroyed. Is there anything else? Marco asked hoarsely. Tony flipped to the last page. After her second discharge, she moved to Boston to live with her grandmother. Martha Sullivan, 78 years old, end-stage kidney failure, needing dialysis 3 times a week, cost about $2,000 a month. Harper worked 3 jobs to cover it. Selling paper flowers during the day, cleaning offices at night, waiting tables at a small diner on weekends. Tony paused, looking at Marco. And the $100. Marco lifted his head. She didn't take it. I had her watched for the past 3 days. The bill's still in the flower basket. She brought it home, put it on the table, looked at it every night, but didn't touch it. Silence weighed down the room. Marco looked back at the file, at the list of Harper Sullivan's losses. Father, mother, sister, mental health, youth, dreams. She'd been a nursing student on a full scholarship. She dropped out to care for her grandmother. She lived in a 1-room apartment in Dorchester with rent of $300 a month, the cheapest she could find. And she didn't touch the $100 even though it could have kept her alive a few more days. Because it belonged to a child who was searching for kindness. Marco stood, walked to the window, and looked out at snow swallowing the city of Boston. 9 years earlier, he'd been 28, newly in control of the family after his father. He'd ordered an attack on Vasquez after they killed one of his men. Vasquez retaliated. Then he struck back. An endless cycle of violence, and somewhere in that spiral, an ordinary family in Portland had burned to death simply because they'd seen something they shouldn't have. He hadn't ordered their deaths, but his war had created the conditions for it to happen. Blood on Vasquez's hands. But some blood on his too. What do you want me to do next? Tony asked. Marco didn't turn around. Nothing. Just keep watching her, and make sure she's safe. Tony nodded and left. Marco stood alone in the office, still holding the photograph of Harper Sullivan at 18. She was smiling so brightly in that picture, the smile of someone who didn't yet know what loss was. He'd taken that smile away. Not directly, but not innocently either. And his son, somehow, had wandered straight to the very woman his world had destroyed to ask for a little kindness, as if the universe were playing a cruel joke, or giving him a chance at redemption. Mateo didn't touch his food for 3 days. The family's private chef cooked every dish he'd ever loved. Pasta carbonara, honey-roasted chicken, homemade pizza. All of it cooled on the table before being cleared away. The 8-year-old boy just sat in his room with colored pencils and drew. He drew the same thing over and over. A brown-haired woman sitting on a park bench. Tony placed the stack of drawings on Marco's desk on the morning of the 4th day. 17 pictures. 17 drawings of the same woman. In some of them she was smiling. In others she was wrapping a scarf around a small boy. One showed her handing over a cup of hot chocolate. And in the corner of every picture, in a child's crooked handwriting, Mateo had written the same word, Mama, with a question mark at the end. Marco stared at the drawings and felt his chest tighten as if something were crushing the air out of him. For 3 years, Mateo had never drawn anything connected to his mother. The boy had frozen that part of his memory, never mentioning it, never touching it, as if Gianna had never existed. The psychologist said it was a defense mechanism. Marco thought it was inherited avoidance, because he did the same thing. But now, after only one night sitting with a stranger in a park, something inside Matteo had cracked open, or maybe finally loosened. "The kid isn't eating," Tony said. "The staff reports he isn't sleeping either. He just lies there staring at the $100 bill and crying." Marco didn't answer. He knew that bill. Matteo had kept it like a treasure. Wouldn't let anyone touch it. Hid it under his pillow every night. The money Harper Sullivan had refused to take. That night, Marco came home earlier than usual. The clock read 11 when he stepped into the mansion. Normally, he would have gone straight to his office, poured a whiskey, and read reports until his eyes were too tired to think about anything else. That was how he dealt with emptiness, by working until exhaustion. But tonight, as he passed Matteo's room, he heard crying, not loud sobs, soft, restrained sounds, as if the boy were trying not to let anyone hear. Marco stopped outside his son's door. For 3 years, whenever he heard that sound, he'd kept walking. He told himself Matteo needed space, that the boy would be fine, that time would heal everything. The truth was he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to comfort his son when he himself was drowning. Tonight was different. Tonight, after reading Harper Sullivan's file, after seeing 17 drawings of a strange woman labeled Mama with a question mark, Marco pushed the door open and went in. Matteo was curled up on the bed, hugging a pillow, the $100 bill lying in front of him. When he saw his father, he didn't hide his tears the way he usually did. He just looked at Marco with reddened eyes and asked one single question. "Why did you send her away?" Marco sat on the edge of the bed. The distance between them was less than a meter, but it felt like an ocean. "I didn't send her away. I pulled you off and didn't let you say goodbye." Matteo clenched the bill. "That's the same thing." Silence pressed down between them. Marco didn't know what to say. He'd negotiated with the most dangerous criminals, ordered killings without his hand shaking, run the city's underworld empire. But in front of his 8-year-old son, he was helpless. "What was special about her?" Marco asked, not accusing, just genuinely wanting to understand. Matteo stayed quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. So softly Marco had to lean closer to hear him. "She looked at me like I was a real person, not a target." The word stabbed into Marco. Target. His son used the word target. An 8-year-old shouldn't know that word, shouldn't understand what it meant. But Matteo had grown up in Marco's world, where everyone was a potential mark, where trust was a luxury and affection was a weapon people could exploit. "What do people see when they look at you?" Marco asked hoarsely. Matteo shrugged. "Castellano's son. Dad's weakness. A way to hurt you." Then the boy lifted his eyes to his father's. The first time in 3 years he'd done that so directly. But she didn't see those things. She just saw a kid who was cold. She gave me her scarf, even though she was cold too. She gave me chocolate, even though it was probably the only thing she had. She didn't take my money. Marco couldn't speak. "She was like Mom," Matteo whispered as tears started falling again. "Not her face or her hair, but the way she looked at me. Mom used to look at me like that too. Like I was her whole world." That night, Marco sat with his son until the boy finally drifted off to sleep. He looked at the crumpled $100 bill in Matteo's hand and made a decision. The next morning, instead of driving to the office at the docks, Marco headed for Dorchester. Alone, no guards. Something anyone in his world would have called suicide. But Marco didn't care. Some things mattered more than his own safety, and his son was one of them. Dorchester wasn't a place meant for someone like Marco Castellano. Narrow streets with trash piled in the corners, aging buildings with flaking brick walls, wary eyes peering from behind curtains as a black Mercedes slid past. This was territory for people who had nothing left to lose. And because of that, it was more dangerous than any Mafia meeting Marco had ever attended. He parked 2 blocks from Harper's building and walked through the falling snow with no Tony and no guards at his back. If anyone in his world knew the Castellano boss was wandering Dorchester alone, he'd have a bullet in his head before he could blink. But something about that woman made Marco unwilling to arrive with an army at his side. Maybe because she'd looked at him like he was nothing more than a failed father instead of the most powerful crime lord in Boston. And maybe because for the first time in a long while, he wanted to be seen as an ordinary man. Harper's building was a 4-story slab of gray concrete with a rusted fire escape clinging to the outside. Marco climbed to the 3rd floor, passing through a narrow hallway lit by flickering bulbs and smelling of damp plaster. Apartment 37B. He stopped before the peeling door and heard a gentle voice drifting from inside. "Drink it all, Grandma, and you'll feel better." I don't want any more, sweetheart. I'm so tired. I know you're tired. But you have to drink it so you can stay with me. You're all I have left. Marco stood there with his hand raised to knock and didn't. Harper's voice when she spoke to her grandmother was nothing like the one she'd used on him that night in the park. Soft, patient, full of love. Exactly the same tone she'd used with Mateo. He drew in a slow breath and knocked. Light footsteps. A cautious "who is it?" Then the door opened. Harper Sullivan stood in front of him in worn clothes, her hair pulled into a messy knot, dark circles beneath eyes dulled by exhaustion. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. There was only endless weariness. You found my place. Of course I did. Men like you always do. She started to close the door, but Marco put his hand against it. I just want to talk. 5 minutes. I don't have 5 minutes for you. My grandmother needs medication every 4 hours, and I've got a cleaning shift at 2 this afternoon. Then 3 minutes. Harper studied him for a long moment, weighing whether he was worth the argument. Then she sighed and stepped aside. But you stay right there. Don't scare my grandmother. Marco entered, and felt as though he'd crossed into another world. The apartment was tiny, maybe not even 30 square meters. A living room that doubled as a kitchen, a bedroom with the door half open, and a cramped bathroom tucked in the corner. The furniture was old but clean. Handmade paper flowers were set everywhere, on the windowsill, on a bookshelf, on the small dining table, bringing flecks of color to the gray space. And in the corner, in a battered armchair, an elderly woman with silver hair sat gazing out the window. Someone there. Sweetheart. Her voice trembled. Just someone I know, Grandma. It's nothing. Harper went to her and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. Finish your medicine, then you rest. All right. The old woman turned cloudy eyes toward Marco. Handsome fellow. Your boyfriend. Harper let out a small laugh, the first time Marco had seen her smile. No, Grandma. Just someone I know. The woman nodded and turned back to the window, apparently forgetting Marco was even there. Harper straightened and motioned for Marco to follow her to the kitchen corner, far enough that Martha wouldn't hear. Your 3 minutes start now. Harper folded her arms across her chest. Marco looked around again. Mateo's $100 bill lay on the table by the window beneath a vase of paper flowers. She still hadn't spent it. How's your son? Harper asked before Marco could speak. The question caught him off guard. She cared. He isn't eating, isn't sleeping. He's been drawing you for 3 days. Marco saw something flicker in her eyes, a brief flash of pain before she masked it. I'm sorry to hear that. But that isn't my problem. It could be your problem, Marco said evenly. If you want it to be. Harper lifted an eyebrow. What do you mean? I want to hire you. To take care of Mateo. Silence. Harper stared at him as if he'd switched languages. Then she laughed, without a trace of humor. You've got to be kidding me. I'm completely serious. You're asking me, a woman who sells paper flowers in a park, to come live in your house and look after the son of a mafia boss. Harper shook her head. You're out of your mind. Mateo trusts you, Marco said, lowering his voice. He hasn't trusted anyone in 3 years. Doesn't speak to people for more than a sentence. But he talked to you. He smiled at you. He called you Mama. Not my problem, Harper repeated, though her voice wasn't as hard as before. It could become your problem, with proper pay, enough to cover your grandmother's dialysis, enough that you wouldn't have to work 3 jobs a day. Harper took a step back, her eyes darkening. You think you can buy me with money. I think I can help you while you help my son. Harper went silent for a long moment. Then she lifted her head and met Marco's gaze with eyes cold as ice. I know who you are, Marco Castellano. Everyone in Boston does. You think I don't know what you do. The people who've died because of you. The families destroyed because of you. She paused, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. I don't work for killers. Marco felt as though he'd been struck. Not because of the insult, but because of the truth in it. He was a killer. He'd tried to separate the man he was from the work he did. But Harper Sullivan didn't allow that division. She saw him exactly as he was, and she refused him. 3 minutes are up. Harper walked to the door and opened it. Please leave. Marco didn't step outside. He stood there staring at the open door, at Harper with that firm look demanding he leave, and he didn't move. She could think whatever she wanted about him. A killer, a mafia boss, a monster. All of it was true, but he hadn't come here for himself. My son hasn't spoken a full sentence in 3 years, Marco said, his voice low and steady. He talks to you. Harper froze, her hand still on the doorknob. She didn't turn back, but she didn't speak either. 3 years, Miss Sullivan, Marco went on. For 3 years I've hired the best psychologists, the most expensive doctors, the most highly trained caregivers. None of them worked. He only answered yes or no, nodded or shook his head, never more than 4 words at a time. He paused and drew in a breath. Then you showed up. One night in a park, 1 cup of hot chocolate, 1 worn scarf, and he talked. He spoke about his mother. He cried. He laughed. He came back to life. Harper still had her back to him. I can't save your son. I'm not asking you to save him. Marco took a step closer. I'm only asking you to be there. She turned around, something wavering in her eyes. Why me? Why does it have to be me? Because my son chose you, Marco answered simply. For the first time in 3 years, he chose someone, and I'm not going to deny him that choice. The apartment sank into silence. From the corner of the room came Martha's dry coughing. Harper glanced toward her, then back at Marco, as if weighing a decision she couldn't undo. If I agree, she said slowly. I have conditions. Marco nodded. I'm listening. A legal employment contract, taxes paid, health insurance, everything according to American law. None of your dirty money. Fine. I won't take part in anything connected to your work. I won't meet your associates. I won't know your business. I won't touch your world. I'm there only for Matteo. Agreed. Harper lifted an eyebrow, clearly surprised by how quickly he answered. I can leave whenever I want. No explanations. No notice. If I feel unsafe, I walk. No binding clauses. Marco clenched his jaw. This was the hardest one to swallow. In his world, nobody walked away freely. What entered didn't leave until he allowed it. But Harper Sullivan didn't belong to his world, and he needed her more than she needed him. All right, he said, his voice stretched tight as wire. Anything else? Harper went quiet for a moment. She stepped closer to him, close enough for Marco to see the faint freckles across the bridge of her nose, close enough to catch the scent of cheap soap and paper flowers. One last thing, Harper said, her voice low but each word precise. If I ever see blood on your hands when you walk into that house with that boy, I'm gone. No explanations, no goodbyes. Marco felt every muscle in his body lock. She was asking him to change. No, she was asking him to hide better. Or maybe she was asking him to choose. Matteo doesn't need to see that, Harper went on. He's been through enough already. If you want me to help him heal, then you can't bring more darkness into that house, at least not where he can see it. Marco stayed silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Fine. Are you sure? I don't make promises I can't keep. Harper studied him, searching for a trace of deceit, but Marco wasn't lying. He would keep his word. Not for Harper, but for Matteo. When do I start? Whenever you're ready. I'll arrange housing for your grandmother near my place. Better medical facilities, round-the-clock care. No, Harper shook her head. My grandmother stays with me. That isn't a condition. That's reality. I'm not going anywhere without her. Marco wanted to argue. A terminal kidney patient inside a Mafia boss's estate could cause endless complications. But he saw the way Harper looked toward Martha, exactly the way she'd looked at Matteo that night, full of love and fierce protection. All right, he said. There'll be a room for her. And a private medical team. Harper opened her mouth to object, but Marco cut in. This isn't charity. It's making sure you can focus on Matteo without worrying about her health. Consider it part of the employment contract. Harper stared at him for a long moment, weighing whether she could trust him. At last she exhaled. I need 2 days to arrange things. Marco nodded and pulled out a business card, setting it on the table beside the $100 bill that still hadn't been touched. Tony's number. Call when you're ready. He'll pick you up. Then he walked to the door, paused at the threshold, and turned back to look at Harper one last time. Thank you. Harper didn't answer. She just stood there watching him with an expression Marco couldn't read. He went down the stairs and out into the frozen snow. When he got into the car, he realized his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but because for the first time in a very long while, he felt hope. 2 days later, a black SUV stopped in front of the Dorchester apartment at exactly 8 in the morning. Tony Russo stepped out and helped Harper and Martha carry their few belongings. Everything the two of them owned fit into 3 battered suitcases and 1 cardboard box filled with paper flowers. As the vehicle left the poor neighborhood behind and rolled into the suburbs of Newton, Harper felt as though she were crossing into another world. The houses grew larger, the distances between them wider, the fences taller, until the SUV stopped before a massive iron gate with security cameras mounted on both sides. The gate slid open automatically, and the vehicle glided down a long stone driveway. Harper looked through the window and counted at least 6 guards patrolling the grounds, dressed in black suits with communication devices in their ears and weapons clearly hidden beneath their coats. The Castellano estate rose before her like a modern fortress. 3 stories of gray stone, large windows reinforced with bulletproof glass, and cameras on every imaginable corner. Beautiful, but so cold, dear. Martha murmured, her voice trembling. Harper squeezed her hand. "We'll be all right, Grandma." Tony opened the car door, and a team of staff hurried out to greet them, carrying the luggage inside while a nurse named Rachel gently guided Martha to a private room on the first floor, already outfitted with full medical equipment. Harper lingered in the main hall, staring up at the soaring ceiling with its crystal chandeliers and sweeping marble staircase. Everything was expensive. Everything felt cold. There wasn't a single family photograph, not a fresh flower anywhere, not one sign that an 8-year-old boy lived here. "Miss Sullivan," Tony said, "I'll show you your room." They went up to the second floor, and along a long corridor lined with classical paintings worth millions. Tony stopped before a pair of oak doors. "This will be yours." He opened them, and Harper stepped inside. The bedroom was at least 60 square meters, with a king-size bed, a balcony overlooking the gardens, a private marble bathroom, and a wardrobe larger than her old apartment. "Mr. Castellano had some clothes and personal items prepared for you," Tony said. "If you need anything else, just let the staff know." Harper scanned the luxurious space and shook her head. "Where's Mateo's room?" "At the end of the hall, 4 doors down." "Is there anything closer to his?" Tony lifted his brows in surprise. "There's a small room right next to his, but it's only a storage room. I want that one." Tony opened his mouth to object, then stopped, nodded, and led her to the far end of the corridor. The room was much smaller than the lavish one, with a single bed, a small desk, and a window facing the backyard. But it was right beside Mateo's, separated by only one wall. "This one," Harper said. "I'll stay here." "I'll inform Mr. Castellano," Tony replied. "Please do." She dropped her bag on the bed and looked around. The room was bare and lifeless, but at least it didn't make her feel like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. "Where's Mateo?" "In his room," Tony answered. "He doesn't come out much." Harper knocked on the neighboring door. No response. She knocked again. "Mateo, it's me, Harper." From the park, silence stretched for a few seconds, then soft footsteps, the click of a lock, and the door opened a crack. Large brown eyes peered at her through the gap, filled with a mix of doubt and fragile hope. "Is it really you? It's really me." Harper smiled. "I'm here now." The door flew open and Mateo rushed forward, wrapping his arms around her. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just clung to her as though she'd vanish if he let go. Harper knelt to his level and gently loosened his grip so she could see his face. He looked thinner than he had that night, dark circles beneath his eyes, clearly not sleeping or eating properly. "You look awful, kid," she said bluntly. Mateo gave a small smile, his first in days. "You do too," Harper laughed. "At least you're honest. All right, show me your room." Mateo's bedroom was spacious and crammed with expensive toys, remote control cars, enormous Lego sets, the newest gaming console, shelves packed with books, but nothing looked used. Everything sat in perfect rows like a showroom display. Only the study corner was messy with colored pencils and drawing paper, and dozens of sketches of the same brown-haired woman. Harper stared at them and felt her heart tighten. She sat on the bed and pulled Mateo beside her. "I need to talk to you seriously." Mateo nodded, tense. "I'm not here because of your dad's money," she said gently. "I'm here because of you. But you need to understand something." The boy waited. "I'm not your mother," Harper said softly but clearly. "I can't replace her, and I'm not trying to." Mateo's eyes dimmed, but he stayed silent. "But I can be your friend," Harper went on. "I can be here when you need me. I can listen when you want to talk, and I'm not going anywhere, at least as long as you want me here." Mateo was quiet for a moment, then he asked, "You promise?" "I promise, but with one condition. You have to eat properly, and you have to talk to me. You don't have to say much, but you have to say something." "All right." Mateo nodded slowly. "Good." Harper stood up. "Now come have lunch with me. I'm starving." And as she walked through the extravagant kitchen of the Castellano estate for the first time, Harper Sullivan felt like an alien dropped into a world that didn't belong to her. But Mateo's small hand was wrapped tightly around hers. And that, for now, was enough. 2 weeks passed like a strange dream. Harper slowly grew accustomed to life inside the Castellano fortress, though she never truly relaxed, with cameras tracking every step and guards drifting through every corridor. She created routines for Mateo, something the boy had never really had before. 7 in the morning, wake up, breakfast together, lessons at midday, supervised time in the garden in the afternoon, reading before bed, the most ordinary things any child should have, and things Mateo hadn't. Until now. On the second Sunday morning, Harper decided to do something different. She got up at 6 and slipped into the kitchen before the family's private chef arrived. The cavernous space held every modern appliance imaginable, but Harper needed only a pan, flour, eggs, and milk. She was mixing batter when she heard soft footsteps behind her. "What are you doing?" Mateo stood in the kitchen doorway, sleep still clinging to his eyes, hair sticking up in every direction. Harper smiled. "Making pancakes. Want to learn?" The boy nodded and came closer. Harper dragged a stool over so Mateo could climb up and reach the counter. She handed him the wooden spoon. "Stir. Keep going until there aren't any lumps left." Mateo took the spoon and began stirring, awkward at first, then faster, harder. Batter splashed out of the bowl and onto his face, but Harper didn't scold him. She just wiped his cheek gently with a towel and smiled. "Good job. Now we pour it into the pan." She guided him through every step. How to pour the batter into neat circles, how to wait until bubbles formed before flipping, how to tell when the pancakes were evenly golden. Mateo's first pancake came out misshapen and slightly burned on one side. He stared at it in disappointment. "It's ugly but delicious." Harper tore off a piece with her fork and popped it into her mouth. Amazing. World-class chef." Mateo laughed, not the small, fleeting smiles of the previous days, but real laughter echoing through the enormous kitchen. Harper felt her heart warm. They made 5 more pancakes, each one a little better than the last. Then they sat at the small kitchen table used by the staff. Not the long, formal dining table with 20 seats no one ever touched, but the modest one tucked in the corner. Harper drizzled honey over Mateo's pancakes and watched him eat. He finished the whole plate. For the first time since she'd arrived, Mateo ate an entire breakfast. "Good?" Harper asked. Mateo nodded, honey smudged at the corner of his mouth. "My mom used to make pancakes too," he murmured, "but Dad didn't let the chefs make them anymore after she died. He said they made him miss her too much." Harper didn't speak, only rested a hand on his shoulder. "Some things make us remember the people we've lost," Harper said, "but that doesn't mean we have to avoid them. Sometimes remembering is another way of loving." Mateo was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Harper. "Do you miss anyone?" "I miss a lot of people," Harper replied. "My father, my mother, my sister. I miss them every day. Where are they?" "They went to heaven, like my mom." Mateo reached for Harper's hand. "So you're alone too, like me?" "Not exactly." Harper squeezed his hand. "I still have my grandmother, and now I have you." In another wing of the estate, Tony Russo was speaking to Marco on the phone. "Sir, there's something you should know." "What is it?" The boy ate breakfast at the kitchen table, for the first time since Mrs. Castellano died. Silence stretched on the other end. Tony went on. "Miss Sullivan taught him how to make pancakes." He laughed. "Sir?" Really laughed. Marco didn't reply. He simply ended the call. That afternoon, Marco came home earlier than usual. The clock had barely reached 5, when normally he didn't return before 10 at night. He walked down the corridor toward the kitchen when he heard laughter drifting out. He stopped at the doorway and didn't go in. Harper and Mateo were sitting at the small kitchen table, a mess of flour and cracked eggs spread before them. They were trying to make cookies and clearly failing spectacularly. Batter streaked Mateo's face, dusted Harper's hair, and covered the floor, but both of them were laughing. "I ruined everything," Mateo said between giggles. "You ruined it. I'm the one who dumped the whole bag of flour." "It's because you sneezed. What does my sneeze have to do with your hands?" They bickered like people who'd known each other all their lives. Marco stood there watching a scene he'd thought he would never witness again after Gianna died. His son was laughing, living, being a normal child. He wanted to step inside, to sit with them, to be part of that moment. But he didn't, because he didn't know how. Because he was afraid he'd shatter it. Because in his world, moments like that were luxuries he didn't deserve. Marco turned away and walked down the hall in silence. But the image of his laughing son carved itself into his mind. And something inside him, something he'd believed had died with Gianna, began to stir. That night, everything changed. 3 weeks after Harper arrived, Marco had grown used to coming home to the sound of laughter somewhere inside the estate. He was used to walking past the kitchen and seeing Matteo's newest drawings stuck to the refrigerator. He was used to knowing his son was being cared for, being loved, slowly becoming a normal child again. But Marco's world didn't allow normal to exist for long. That night, one of his men was captured while moving cargo through the docks, not by the police, but by Vasquez's people. They tortured him for 6 hours before Marco located the holding site. The rescue was swift and soaked in blood. Marco personally dealt with 3 Vasquez men, including the one who'd held a knife and sliced off his man's fingers. He didn't regret it. In this world, mercy was a lethal weakness. But sitting in the car on the way home, Marco looked down at his hands and realized he'd forgotten. He'd forgotten to change his clothes. He'd forgotten to wash his hands. He'd forgotten to hide. Dried blood had darkened to brown on the sleeves of his white shirt, spread like a map of the sins he'd committed. Normally, he would have stopped at a safe apartment to change before returning home. That was a rule he'd set when Matteo was still small. Never bring blood home. Never let his son see it. But tonight he was exhausted, too tired to think, and he'd forgotten. The Mercedes pulled into the garage close to 2 a.m. Marco stepped out, went through the back entrance, and climbed the stairs in darkness. He didn't turn on the lights, not wanting to wake anyone, but when his foot reached the top step of the second-floor staircase, he stopped. Harper was sitting there, on the highest step, her back against the railing, knees drawn to her chest. She was still in simple sleepwear, hair loose around her shoulders, eyes fixed on him, fixed on the bloodstains on his sleeves. Silence pressed down like stone on Marco's chest. He stood there beneath moonlight, slipping through the hallway windows. Proof of what he truly was laid bare in front of the woman who'd brought laughter back to his son's life. She didn't scream, didn't run, didn't look at him with the horror he'd expected. She just sat there, watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she stood. "Matteo's asleep," she said, her voice strangely calm. "He had a nightmare about his mother. Cried for almost an hour. He's all right now." Marco wanted to speak, to explain, to defend himself, to say he had no choice, that this was his world, that he did what he had to in order to protect his family. But no words left his mouth, because looking into Harper's eyes, he knew she didn't need any explanations. She'd known who he was from the very beginning. She'd told him to his face that she didn't work for killers, and she was still here. Not because of him, but because of Matteo. Harper walked past him toward her room. She didn't look back, didn't say anything else, but the space between them as she passed, the way she made sure her body didn't brush against his even slightly, said everything. Marco stood alone in the dark hallway, watching her back until she disappeared behind her door. Then he looked down at his hands. The blood had dried stiff and cracked against his skin. This wasn't the first time his hands had been stained, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But it was the first time he felt ashamed, not of what he'd done, but of letting someone see it. No, not that. He felt ashamed of letting Harper see it. The woman who sat with his son when nightmares came. The woman who taught Matteo to make pancakes and laughed when flour covered his face. The woman who'd brought light back into a house, drowned in darkness for 3 years. She'd seen the real shadow in him, and she'd turned away. Marco went into the bathroom, turned on the hot water, and started scrubbing his hands. He scrubbed until the skin flushed raw, until the water ran red and then clear again. But no matter how much he rubbed, he still felt the blood there. Not on his hands, somewhere deeper, a place water couldn't reach. That night, Marco didn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Harper's eyes. Not disgust, not fear, the way he'd assumed, but disappointment, as though she'd hoped he was better than that, as though she'd begun to believe he could be someone else, and he'd proven her wrong. That hurt him more than anything. Not the judgment, the disappointment. For the first time in his life, the Castellano boss wanted to be someone different, someone worthy of the hope another person had placed in him. Everything happened on an ordinary afternoon. Harper was helping Matteo with his homework in the living room when she stood and reached for a dictionary on the high shelf. The loose sleeve of her sweater slid down, exposing her bare wrist. Marco had just stepped into the room and froze as though nailed to the floor. The scars, faded with time but still there. 2 thin, parallel lines across Harper's left wrist, remnants of a past he'd read about in a file but had never truly seen. Harper grabbed the book and turned back, her sleeve falling into place again. She didn't realize Marco was standing in the doorway. She didn't know he'd seen them. But Marco did, and the image followed him all day. He didn't ask her directly, not because he feared the answer, but because he knew it wasn't his place. Harper Sullivan didn't owe him any explanation for the marks on her body, but he needed to know she was all right. Not out of curiosity, he told himself, but for Matteo's sake. At least that was what he told himself. The next day, Marco called Dr. Catherine Wells, the Castellano family physician for 20 years. She'd delivered Matteo, cared for Gianna in her final days, and was one of the very few people Marco trusted without reservation. "I want you to check on Miss Sullivan," Marco said. "A full exam, as part of employee policy." Dr. Wells was quiet for a moment on the other end. "Is there something specific you want me to look for?" "Nothing specific. Just make sure she's healthy, physically and mentally." Marco heard her sigh. "All right, I'll arrange it." That afternoon, Dr. Wells arrived at the estate under the pretense of routine medical checks for all staff. Harper didn't question it, calmly letting the doctor draw blood, take her blood pressure, and ask the usual questions. Marco waited in his study, staring out at the yard through the window. An hour later, Dr. Wells knocked and entered. She sat across from him and placed a thin folder on the desk. "Physically, she's healthy," she said. "A little sleep-deprived, a little undernourished, but nothing serious. And mentally," Dr. Wells studied Marco for a long moment. "You saw the scars." It wasn't a question. Marco nodded. "They're old," she said. "At least 7 to 8 years. She isn't in immediate danger anymore. I asked a few screening questions for depression, and she tested within normal limits. But," she paused, "but what? But scars like that never truly heal. Not physically, but emotionally. She'll carry them for the rest of her life, as reminders of her darkest time. What matters is whether she has a reason to keep living." Dr. Wells rose and looked at Marco with the same gaze she'd used since he was a boy. "And Marco, you should be asking yourself that same question." She left him alone in the study with the folder and his tangled thoughts. He reopened Harper's file Tony had prepared earlier. Read again the cold lines about 2 psychiatric hospitalizations, about diagnoses of severe depression and post-traumatic stress, about months spent battling suicidal thoughts after losing her entire family. Then he reached the part about her second discharge. The guarantor was Martha Sullivan, her grandmother, and after that, there were no more hospital records. Harper Sullivan had wanted to die. She'd tried to end her pain twice, but she'd stopped, because of her grandmother, because the only person left who needed her. Marco set the file down and looked out the window. The Boston night sky was pitch black, not a star in sight. He remembered the days after Gianna died, remembered the gun he'd pressed to his temple in the bathroom, the chamber loaded, his finger resting on the trigger. He remembered the only thing that had stopped him from pulling it, Matteo's crying from the room next door. He'd wanted to die too. He'd tried to end the pain as well. But he'd stopped, because of his son, because the only person left who needed him. Harper Sullivan and Marco Castellano, 2 people from different worlds, carrying different scars, yet strangely alike. Both had wanted to die. Both had chosen to live for someone else. And maybe, Marco thought as he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the dark, maybe that was why Matteo had chosen her, because the boy, with the instinct of a child who'd lost his mother, had recognized what adults missed, that Harper Sullivan understood pain, and that she would never abandon anyone, because she knew exactly what it felt like to be left behind. 2 in the morning was the hour of ghosts. Marco knew that because he'd lived with them for 3 years now. Every night, when the entire estate sank into silence, he woke with the image of Gianna collapsing in front of him, blood spreading across the white dress she'd worn that evening. Tonight was no different. He jolted awake at 1:45, his back soaked with sweat, his heart hammering wildly. Unable to fall asleep again, he went downstairs to the kitchen to fetch a bottle of whiskey, like he did on every sleepless night. But when he stepped inside, he stopped. Harper was sitting at the small table in the corner of the kitchen, where she and Matteo usually ate breakfast together. In front of her sat a glass of water in the empty space she was staring into. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and for a split second their eyes met. Neither of them spoke. Marco went to the liquor cabinet, took out a bottle of 30-year-old Macallan and 2 glasses. He set one in front of Harper, poured, then poured for himself. Harper looked at the glass, then at him. "I don't drink. Tonight you should try," Marco said as he sat across from her with the small table between them. "It helps." Harper didn't ask what it helped with. She lifted the glass, took a small sip, and winced at the burn. Silence stretched between them, not the uncomfortable kind that begged to be filled with pointless words, but the kind shared by two people too tired to pretend. Marco studied Harper in the dim kitchen light. She looked smaller than usual, more fragile. Her hair loose and tangled, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep. She wasn't beautiful in the glossy way of the women who usually surrounded him, but there was something about her he couldn't look away from. Maybe it was the honesty in her gaze. Maybe it was the way she never tried to be anyone but herself. "Nightmares?" Harper asked, breaking the quiet. Marco nodded. "You too." It wasn't a question. Harper nodded and took another sip of whiskey, this time without grimacing. They sat there drinking in silence, staring into nothing. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting off the seconds of the deep night. "Gianna died in front of Matteo," Marco said suddenly, his voice low and rough. He didn't know why he'd said it out loud. Maybe because 2 a.m. was the hour of truth. Maybe because the alcohol had loosened the walls he kept around himself. Maybe because she was the only person he could speak to without playing the role of the powerful boss. Harper didn't interrupt, only watched him and waited. "We were going out to dinner," Marco went on, his eyes fixed on his glass. "Her favorite place in the North End. Matteo was 5, sitting between us, eating spaghetti and getting sauce all over his shirt. Gianna laughed and said she'd clean him up. Then our car was ambushed as soon as we left the restaurant." He stopped and swallowed hard. "I shoved Matteo down onto the floor of the car and covered her, but I wasn't fast enough. 1 bullet. Just one came through the window and hit her in the chest. She died in my arms while Matteo watched. The silence that followed was heavy. Harper didn't offer hollow comforts like 'I'm sorry' or 'that must have been terrible.' She just sat there, looking at him with eyes that understood too much for someone who shouldn't have to. "My family burned to death while I was stocking shelves at a 7-Eleven, Harper said flatly, as if she were telling someone else's story. "I was working the night shift from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning to earn money for textbooks for the coming semester. My phone battery had died, so I didn't know anyone had called. When I got home at 6:30, there was nothing left but ashes and fire trucks." She paused and took a long swallow of whiskey. "They said my parents and my sister died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. I don't know if that makes it better or worse." Marco didn't speak. He understood. No words could soften her pain any more than words could soften his. Sometimes silence was the only thing big enough to hold that kind of loss. They stayed there until the bottle was a quarter empty. Neither of them said anything more about the past. Neither tried to comfort or advise the other. They just sat there, two broken people in the same kitchen, sharing the same darkness. Close to 4 in the morning, Harper stood. "I should go to bed," she said. "Matteo wakes up early." Marco nodded but didn't rise. Harper took a few steps, then stopped and turned back to him. "You can't change the past," she said. "No one can, but you can decide who you're going to be tomorrow." She left him alone in the kitchen with the whiskey and his tangled thoughts. He stared at the empty space where she'd been sitting, thinking about what she'd said. He could decide who he was going to be tomorrow. For the first time in 3 years, Marco Castellano thought that maybe, just maybe, he wanted to become someone else. Not only for Matteo. Not just for Matteo, but also for the woman who had seen his darkness and hadn't run. Everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Marco was sitting in his office at the docks, reviewing financial reports when Tony walked in with a tight expression and set a white envelope on the desk. No return name, no address, only a South Boston postmark, Vasquez territory. Marco opened it and felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. Inside were 3 photographs. The first showed Harper's old Dorchester apartment where she had lived before coming to the Castellano estate. The second captured Martha being pushed in a wheelchair by a nurse through the mansion hallway. And the third showed Harper and Matteo baking in the kitchen, shot through a window from outside the grounds. A small slip of paper lay with them, handwritten. "The Sullivan girl who survived Portland. Interesting. Signed Miguel Vasquez." Marco clenched his jaw until it ached. Miguel Vasquez, eldest son of the old Vasquez boss, the man who had ordered the Sullivan house burned 9 years earlier. He had found Harper. He knew she was living under Marco's roof. And he was sending a message. "Tony, double security," Marco said, his voice cold as steel. "Round-the-clock patrols. Nobody in or out without clearance. And Martha. Marco paused, calculating fast. Move her to the family medical facility in Beacon Hill. Private doctors, private guards. No one knows the address but us. And Miss Sullivan. She stays here. Safer under my control. Tony nodded and left. Marco stared again at the photographs, especially the one of Harper and Mateo. They had gotten that close. They had seen his son. And Harper. If Vasquez knew she was the survivor from 9 years ago, they wouldn't leave her alone. Not because she knew anything, but because she was living proof of their crime. A link that could reopen an old case if anyone decided to dig. Marco didn't tell Harper. He knew how she would react if she learned she was being threatened. She would want to leave, take Martha with her, face danger on her own instead of hiding behind him. She was proud like that, reckless like that. So he acted quietly. Martha was transferred the next morning under the excuse of needing specialized treatment at a more advanced facility. Harper wasn't warned. She discovered it when she went to greet her grandmother as usual and found the bed empty. 10 minutes later, she was standing outside Marco's office at the estate, eyes blazing. "Where is my grandmother?" Harper demanded, her voice shaking with restraint. Marco set down his pen and looked at her evenly. "Mrs. Sullivan is at my family medical center in Beacon Hill. Better care than here. Who gave you the right to decide that?" "I decided for her safety." Harper stepped inside and shut the door behind her, crossed to the desk, planted her hands on the surface and leaned toward him. "Safety. My grandmother needs dialysis 3 times a week and you move her without saying a word and call that safety. You'll understand when I explain." "Then explain." Marco was quiet for a moment, then opened a drawer, took out the envelope of photographs, and slid it toward her. She lifted them, turned them one by one, and Marco watched the color drain from her face. "What is this?" Harper asked, the anger gone, replaced by fear she tried to hide. "Vasquez knows you're here," Marco said flatly. "They know who you are. They know you survived Portland 9 years ago, and they're sending a message." Harper stared at the photo of her and Mateo in the kitchen, taken through glass. Her hand trembled slightly, though she forced herself steady. "So you moved my grandmother to protect her." "I moved her because if Vasquez wants leverage over you, she's the easiest target." Harper set the photos down and met Marco's gaze. "You don't get to control my life," she said slowly, each word precise. "I came here for Mateo, not to become a chess piece in your Mafia war. If you want to protect me, tell me. If you want to move my grandmother, ask me. Don't decide for me like I'm something that belongs to you." Marco rose, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. Less than a step between them. "You want me to ask you?" Marco said, low and taut. "Fine, I'm asking. Do you want to see your grandmother shot the way Gianna was in front of Mateo? Do you want a phone call telling you she was slaughtered in her hospital bed? Do you want to lose the only family you have left all over again?" Harper didn't answer. She stood there, breathing shallow and fast, eyes locked on his. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Marco said, his tone softening slightly but still iron hard. "You can hate me as much as you want, but I won't apologize for protecting the people in my house." Silence stretched between them. Then Harper stepped back as if realizing how close they had been standing. "I want to see my grandmother," she said, calmer now. "Today. Tony will take you." Marco nodded. "But from now on you don't leave the grounds without protection." Harper didn't argue. She only nodded, picked up the photographs, and walked out. Marco watched her go, and in that moment he realized he was willing to do anything to keep her safe. Not only for Mateo, but for her. Salvatore Castellano was 62 years old, the younger brother of Marco's father, and the family's consigliere for 30 years. He'd watched the clan survive countless wars, countless enemies, countless moments on the brink of collapse, and he'd always been there, advising, guiding, sometimes manipulating from the shadows. He'd hoped Marco would be as ruthless as his father. But lately, Salvatore had been seeing things that unsettled him. Marco was coming home early instead of staying late to handle business. Marco was canceling critical meetings because his son had a school presentation. Marco, the most powerful boss in Boston, was being distracted by a woman who sold paper flowers in a park. And now, with Vasquez threatening them, instead of striking first like any boss would, Marco was focused on protecting that woman, moving her grandmother to a secure facility, doubling her guards, placing her safety above the family's strategy. Salvatore knew he had to act. He sought Harper out one afternoon while Marco was at the docks, and Mateo was studying with his tutor. She was sitting in the back garden making paper flowers as she did every day when he appeared. "Miss Sullivan," Salvatore said with a polite smile. I'm Salvatore Castellano, Marco's uncle. We haven't had a chance to speak properly. Harper studied the older man warily. She'd heard Marco mention him, and Marco's tone whenever he spoke of his uncle had never been warm. What do you want? Just to introduce myself. Salvatore sat in the chair across from her without being invited. You've been here nearly 2 months, and I haven't had the courtesy to greet you in person. An unfortunate oversight. Harper didn't respond, only kept folding the delicate paper petals. Silence didn't discourage Salvatore. He glanced around the garden, then back at her with an assessing look. You know about the war between us and Vasquez, don't you? Marco mentioned it. But did he mention Portland? Harper's hands froze mid-fold. She looked up at Salvatore, her heart beginning to pound. Portland. Salvatore nodded, his face arranged into counterfeit sympathy. The Sullivan house fire 9 years ago. Your parents and your sister. Tragic. What do you know about that? Harper asked, her voice pulled tight as wire. I know everything, my dear Miss Sullivan. Salvatore leaned forward. Your family died because they accidentally witnessed a Vasquez hit. You already knew that, didn't you? Marco must have shown you the file. Harper nodded slowly, unsure where he was steering this. But do you know why Vasquez was in Portland that night? Salvatore went on. Why they were executing someone hundreds of miles from Boston? Silence. Salvatore smiled, the smile of a man delivering the final blow. Because of us. The Castellano family. The week before, Marco, then only 28, had ordered an attack on a Vasquez operation in Maine. 4 of their men were killed. Vasquez retaliated by hunting down and eliminating a traitor of ours hiding in Portland. Your family saw the wrong people at the wrong time, and they left no witnesses. Harper felt as though she'd been punched in the stomach. The world blurred around her, sound drifting away. Salvatore's voice seemed to reach her through water. You're sleeping under the roof of the man whose war killed your family. You're caring for his son, eating food paid for with his dirty money, maybe even starting to feel something for him. I thought you deserved to know the truth, Salvatore said as he stood and straightened his jacket. Before you sink too deep, Marco might show you part of the story, but he'll never admit his role in your tragedy. He's a killer, Miss Sullivan, and there's blood on his hands that belongs to your family too. He walked away, leaving Harper alone in the garden with paper petals scattered at her feet and a world that had just collapsed. Marco's war, Marco's order to attack, her parents, her sister. Lily was only 15. Lily loved to draw and dreamed of becoming an artist. Lily hadn't even had her first kiss, and Lily burned to death in her bedroom because Marco Castellano ordered 4 men killed in Maine. Harper didn't know how long she sat there. Minutes, maybe hours. When she finally stood, her legs trembled but her eyes were dry. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears 9 years ago. She felt only emptiness and rage. Not at Salvatore for telling the truth, but at herself for starting to believe Marco Castellano could be anything other than what he truly was. A killer. The killer whose war had taken her family from her. Harper waited for Marco in the study. She didn't know what time he'd come back, but she would wait, even if it took until morning, because she needed to look him in the eye when she asked this question and see whether he'd lie or tell the truth. The clock struck 8 p.m. When the door opened, Marco stepped inside and stopped when he saw Harper sitting in the leather chair across from his desk, the room dark except for a single lamp casting golden light that made her face look carved from ice. Harper, he said, closing the door behind him. What's wrong? She stood, didn't shout, didn't cry, showed no emotion at all, only the terrifying stillness of someone who'd crossed beyond anger into frozen calm. Did you know, she asked in a voice so steady it was unsettling, when you came to my apartment in Dorchester, when you offered me this job, did you know your war made me an orphan? Marco didn't move, didn't ask how she'd found out or what she knew, only stood there as his gray eyes darkened. Answer me, Harper said, her tone still calm while her hands curled into fists. Marco drew a slow breath. I found out later, after I met you in the park, after Matteo had already bonded with you. Tony investigated and uncovered the connection between your house fire and the war between us and Vasquez. So you knew. Harper stepped closer. You knew and you didn't tell me. I should have told you, Marco admitted, the moment I learned, but I didn't. Why? Because I was afraid. Silence pressed down between them. Marco Castellano, the most powerful mafia boss in Boston, had just admitted fear. Harper searched his face for deception, and found none. Afraid of what? Of losing you, Marco said plainly. Afraid you'd leave when you learned the truth. Afraid Mateo would lose you. You should have left me alone, Harper said, her voice trembling for the first time. You never should have come to my apartment. Never should have pulled me into your life. Never should have let Mateo get attached to me. I know. I should have let you keep selling paper flowers in that park without knowing anything about me, about my family, about my war. But I was selfish. Marco stepped closer. I was selfish because my son laughed for the first time in 3 years. Because of you. Because I saw light in his eyes when you were near. Because I wanted to keep that for him no matter the cost. Even if it meant lying to me. Even if it meant hiding the truth that you indirectly killed my family. I didn't order your house burned, Marco said. That was Vasquez. And whose war created the circumstances for Vasquez to do it? Harper shot back, sharp as a blade. My parents and my sister died because they saw Vasquez's men execute a traitor. Your traitor? In your war? On territory you and Vasquez were fighting over. Marco didn't answer because there was nothing he could say. She was right. The blood might not have been directly on his hands, but his war had created the conditions for it to spill. I'm leaving, Harper said, turning toward the door. I'm packing and getting out tonight. Harper, Marco called, but didn't stop her because he knew he had no right. Don't say my name. She paused without turning back. You lost that privilege. She left the study and went straight to her room, yanked her suitcase from under the bed, opened the closet, and began throwing clothes inside. She hadn't brought much, just a few outfits, a few books, supplies for making paper flowers. It wouldn't take more than 10 minutes to pack everything. She'd call a taxi to Beacon Hill, collect Martha, and disappear somewhere, anywhere that didn't involve Marco Castellano. But when she turned around with an armful of clothes, Mateo was standing in the doorway, the 8-year-old in superhero pajamas, hair sticking up in every direction, eyes red and wet from crying. What are you doing? He asked in a shaky voice. Honey. Harper dropped the clothes and knelt in front of him. Why aren't you asleep? I heard you and Dad arguing. Mateo's gaze drifted to the open suitcase. Are you leaving? Harper didn't know what to say. She couldn't lie to this child who'd trusted her from the first night in the park, but she couldn't tell him the truth either, that his father's war had helped kill her family. I have to go, Mateo, she said softly. I'm sorry. Why? He stepped closer. Did I do something wrong? You promised you wouldn't leave. You said you'd stay as long as I needed you. I still need you. Her heart shattered at the sight of his brown eyes filling with tears. It's not your fault, sweetheart. Your dad and I have grown-up problems, things you don't have to understand. Mateo grabbed her hand, squeezing hard as if she might vanish if he loosened his grip. Please don't go. Tears slid down his cheeks. You're the only one who stayed. My mom went away. Dad's always busy. Nannies come and go. Tutors come and go. Everybody leaves. But you stayed. You said you would. Please. Harper stared at him, at the boy begging her to remain, and realized she was standing at the cruelest crossroads of her life. Stay under the roof of the man whose war had killed her family, or leave and break the heart of a child who'd already lost too much. Harper stayed, not because she forgave Marco, but because she couldn't look into Mateo's eyes and say no. So she repacked her suitcase, shoved it into the corner of the room, and told the boy she'd remain a little longer. Yet everything had changed. She no longer spoke to Marco except when necessary. No longer sat with him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, built an invisible wall between them, and refused to let him cross it. And Marco accepted that because he knew he had no right to demand more, but Salvatore didn't accept it at all. 3 days after the confrontation between Harper and Marco, Salvatore convened a family council meeting. 7 men sitting around an oak table in a hidden basement room of an Italian restaurant in the North End. Marco at the head, Salvatore to his right, 5 capos lining both sides, the air heavy like the moment before a storm. We've got a problem, Salvatore began, his voice low and calculated, and that problem's named Harper Sullivan. Marco clenched his hand beneath the table but said nothing. She's the surviving witness from Portland, Salvatore went on, scanning the room. Vasquez knows she's in our house. They're using her as leverage, saying she's proof that could get the FBI to reopen the case and drag both families into a federal investigation. And you believe Vasquez? Marco asked calmly. I believe logic, Salvatore replied. She knows too much. She lives under your roof, hears conversations, sees who comes and goes. She's a liability, Marco, a weakness any enemy can exploit. One of the capos spoke up. Salvatore's got a point. Vasquez hit 2 of our facilities last week. They're escalating, and every time they mention the Sullivan girl. "So what's your proposal, Uncle Salvatore?" Marco asked, eyes never leaving him. "Remove her," Salvatore said bluntly. "Doesn't have to mean killing her. Just make her disappear. New identity, new city. Never come back to Boston. And if she refuses to cooperate, we've got other ways to make sure she isn't a problem." Silence flooded the room, the capos trading glances, none daring to speak, because they all knew this wasn't just about Harper Sullivan. It was a power struggle between Marco and Salvatore, between the new guard and the old. "And you," Salvatore fixed Marco with a stare. "You've let her distract you for too long. The other families are watching, saying Boss Castellano's gone soft over a woman, that you're putting feelings above the family. And if you don't deal with this, the council will have to reconsider your leadership." Marco looked around the table, reading every face, some siding with Salvatore, some neutral, none openly backing him. "This is an ultimatum," Salvatore said, a hint of triumph in his tone. "Her or your position. Choose." The meeting ended without a formal decision, Marco saying he needed time to think, and no one dared push further, but everyone knew the clock was ticking. That night, Marco came home later than usual and stood outside Harper's door for a long moment. Before knocking, she opened it with sleepless eyes, already in pajamas, hair neatly tied, as if she'd been waiting. "Come in," she said shortly, stepping aside. Marco entered and closed the door. The small room she'd chosen over the lavish one, still simple, except for a few paper flowers on the windowsill. "I heard there was a council meeting," Harper said without preamble. "About me." Marco nodded, not asking how she knew because nothing in this house stayed secret for long. "You need to disappear," he said, his voice weighed down by something unseen. "New identity, new city. I'll arrange everything. Money, documents, housing. You and Martha'll be safe." Harper studied him in silence. "That's how you handle this. Sending me away to keep your throne." "It's the only way to keep you alive," Marco replied. "Salvatore wants to eliminate you another way. I'm trying to protect you. Protect me, or protect yourself." "Both," Marco admitted. "I won't lie to you anymore." Harper turned to the window, the Boston sky pitch black without a star. "What about Matteo?" she asked quietly. Marco didn't answer, and the silence stretched long enough that Harper turned back and saw something she'd never expected on the face of the most powerful mafia boss in Boston. "Pain, helplessness. You don't have an answer, do you?" she said. "You'll let me go and tell Matteo what? That I left him too like everyone else. That I'm just another adult who didn't keep her promise." Marco stayed silent because there wasn't a right answer, no choice that didn't destroy someone. Harper watched him for a long moment, then sighed. "Give me time," she said. "I'll decide how I leave." Marco nodded and walked out, and when the door shut behind him, he leaned against the hallway wall and closed his eyes. Because for the first time in his life, Marco Castellano didn't know what to do. Harper couldn't sleep that night. She lay, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Matteo, about Marco, about the life she'd built over the past 2 months beneath this roof. She thought about the promise she'd made to the boy, that she'd stay as long as he needed her. And she thought about the brutal truth that staying didn't just endanger her life. It also put Matteo in danger. Vasquez knew she was here. They were using her as an excuse to strike. And as long as she stayed, Matteo would always be tangled up as a target. So she made her decision at 3 a.m. She would leave, but on her terms, not taking Marco's money, not accepting the new identity he'd offered, not letting him arrange her life as if she were a problem to be solved. She'd survived on her own for 9 years, and she'd keep doing so. Harper got up, switched on the desk lamp, took out a sheet of white paper and a pen, sat down, and wrote every word as though carving it into stone. "Matteo, my dear, by the time you read this letter, I won't be here anymore. I want you to know that me leaving isn't your fault. It never is. I'm leaving because sometimes loving someone means stepping away so they can be safe. I know you'll be angry, and you have every right to be. I promised I'd stay, and now I'm breaking that promise. But remember one thing. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing even when you're afraid. I'm scared to leave you. I'm scared you'll think I'm like everyone else who walked away. But I have to do what's right, no matter how much it hurts. You're the most wonderful boy I've ever met, Matteo. You're smart, kind, and stronger than you realize. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. And don't blame your father. He loves you more than anything in this world. He just doesn't know how to show it. Give him a chance. I'll miss you every day. Every time I make pancakes, I'll think of you. Every time I see snow falling, I'll remember the night we met in the park. You changed my life, Matteo. You gave me a reason to keep living when I thought I'd run out of reasons. Thank you for that. I'll love you forever. Harper. She folded the letter and set it on the table beside Matteo's bed, stood there for a long moment, watching him sleep in the moonlight slipping through the curtains. His face peaceful, free of the nightmares that usually haunted him. Then she bent down and pressed a final kiss to his forehead. Sleep well, kid, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. At 4 a.m., Harper left the Castellano estate with her battered suitcase and a small bag, taking nothing from this life except the paper flowers she'd made herself, Matteo's $100 bill she left behind on the table in her room, neatly beneath a paper rose, and Tony was waiting for her at the gate just as she'd asked. He didn't question where she was going, only drove her to the Beacon Hill Medical Facility to collect Martha. Does Mr. Castellano know you're leaving? Tony asked when they stopped outside. He knows I was going to leave, Harper replied. He just doesn't know it's tonight. Tony studied her in the rearview mirror. You're a good woman, Miss Sullivan. The kid'll miss you. Harper didn't answer. She stepped out of the car and went inside to get Martha. And an hour later, they were on a Greyhound bus, rolling away from Boston toward a small town in Maine she'd heard of but never visited. She watched the city vanish into darkness through the window and didn't allow herself to cry. Back at the Castellano estate, Matteo woke at 7 a.m. Like always, climbed out of bed, and padded to Harper's room to wake her for breakfast the way he did every morning. But her room was empty, the bed neatly made, the closet standing open with nothing inside, only the $100 bill left on the table beside a paper rose. And Matteo stood there staring at the hollow space, feeling the world collapse beneath his feet once again. He walked to the table, picked up the money, and saw the folded letter near the pillow, opened it, and read every line, every word, and when he finished, he didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't lash out the way he used to when emotions overwhelmed him. He just stood there in silence with the letter and the bill in his hands, staring into nothing. Then he folded the letter, tucked it into the pocket of his pajamas, and went back to his room, sat on the bed, stared out the window, and didn't say a word. When the housekeeper came to call him for breakfast, he didn't answer. When Marco came home and asked if he was all right, he didn't answer. When Tony tried to speak to him, he didn't answer. Matteo Castellano, 8 years old, had stopped talking completely, not because he was angry, not because he wanted to punish anyone, but because he had nothing left to say. The only person he wanted to talk to had walked away, just like his mother, just like everyone else. 3 weeks passed like a living hell. Matteo didn't speak, didn't smile, barely ate. He spent hours sitting by the window staring out at the courtyard where he'd once run with Harper, his hand clenched around the crumpled $100 bill, as if it were the only thing still tying him to her. Marco hired psychologists, pediatricians, even an art therapist, but no one could make Matteo open his mouth. The boy was a ghost in his own house, physically present while his soul had drifted somewhere far away. Then on the 18th day, Matteo collapsed in his room. A housekeeper found him on the floor, skin pale, lips cracked, pulse so faint it was almost impossible to feel. The ambulance arrived within 10 minutes, and Matteo was rushed to Massachusetts, general and critical condition, from severe exhaustion. Marco got the call while meeting with the capos about Vasquez. He abandoned everything, bolted for his car, and tore through the streets at a speed that would have killed anyone else. By the time he arrived, Matteo had already been taken into the emergency room. Doctor Wells was waiting in the hallway, his face tight with worry. How is he? Marco asked, his voice hoarse. Severe dehydration. Malnutrition. He hasn't been eating or drinking properly for 3 weeks. His body's shutting itself down. Marco, doctor, Wells said, locking eyes with him. This isn't just physical. The boy's refusing to live. Marco leaned against the wall, feeling his legs threaten to give out. He'd lost Gianna. He couldn't lose Matteo. He wouldn't survive losing his son, too. Then his phone rang. Tony. He almost ignored it, but Tony called again. And Marco answered. Not now, Tony. Boss. Vasquez hit the warehouse at the docks, Tony said tensely. They burned it to the ground. 3 of our men are dead, and they left a message. Marco closed his eyes. What message? They said this is only the beginning. They won't stop until the Castellano family collapses completely, and they sent their regards to Miss Sullivan. Marco hung up without another word. 2 fronts. His son was wasting away in a hospital bed while the empire he'd spent 10 years building was burning outside. He couldn't be in both places. He had to choose, and this time Marco Castellano didn't hesitate for even a second. He shut off his phone, walked into Matteo's room, and sat beside his son's bed. Matteo lay there small and colorless amid IV lines and heart monitors, eyes closed, breathing steady but weak. Marco took his son's tiny hand, and for the first time in years he prayed. He didn't know who he was praying to or whether anyone was listening, but he begged, "Please don't take my son. I'll do anything. I'll give up everything. Just let him live." Hours crawled by like years. Marco didn't leave the room, didn't answer calls, didn't care what was happening outside. The empire could fall. Vasquez could win. Salvatore could take his seat. He didn't care anymore. Near midnight, Matteo opened his eyes, stared at the hospital ceiling, then slowly turned his head toward Marco. There was something in his gaze that hadn't been there for 3 weeks. A small flame burning, but not the flame of hope. It was the flame of anger. "Dad," Matteo said, his voice rough from disuse. Marco nearly fell out of his chair. "Son," he squeezed Matteo's hand. "You're talking. I'll get the doctor." But Matteo didn't care about the doctor. He looked straight at his father and said the words Marco would remember for the rest of his life. "You let her go, like you let Mom die." Marco felt as if something had driven straight through his chest. "Matteo, I always say I'll protect everyone," Matteo continued, tears sliding down his cheeks while his voice stayed eerily calm for an 8-year-old. "But you didn't protect Mom. You didn't keep Harper. You didn't protect anyone. You're only good at killing people." "Son," Matteo pulled his hand away. "I wish Harper were my mom. I wish you weren't my dad." Silence crushed the room. Marco sat there, staring at his child while everything inside him shattered into a million pieces. He'd endured Gianna's death. He'd endured Harper leaving. But he couldn't endure this. His son, his own blood, was looking at him with hatred and disappointment. And the worst part was that Matteo was right. Marco had failed to protect the people he loved. He'd let Gianna die. He'd let Harper leave. And he'd nearly let his son die from heartbreak. The most powerful Mafia boss in Boston bowed his head and cried, for the first time since Gianna's funeral, for the first time since he realized he'd lost everything without even knowing it. 2 days after Matteo woke up, Marco convened the family council again. This time it wasn't in the hidden basement room of the restaurant. This time the meeting took place in his main office at the docks, where Castellano power truly resided. 7 men sat around the table, including Salvatore with a look of smug anticipation. He assumed this meeting would be Marco declaring all-out war on Vasquez, or better yet, admitting defeat and surrendering leadership. He was wrong. Marco stood at the head of the table instead of sitting, studying each face and reading the doubt, the anxiety, and in some cases the poorly concealed contempt. "I have an announcement," Marco said calmly. His voice carried through the room. "I will meet Miguel Vasquez tomorrow, to negotiate peace." The room erupted in murmurs and sharp objections. Salvatore was the first to speak. "Peace," he nearly shouted. "They just burned our warehouse, killed 3 of our men, and you want to negotiate. Have you lost your mind?" "I want to end this war that's lasted 20 years, Marco replied. "How many have we lost? How many have they lost? And what's the result? Nobody wins, nobody loses, only blood and grief." "This is weakness," Salvatore snapped as he rose and pointed at Marco. "This is betrayal of the family. Your father would never have done this." "My father died because of this war," Marco said, his voice turning colder. "My wife died because of it, and I won't let my son lose his father to it too." Silence fell over the room. Marco went on. "I'll meet Vasquez with clear terms. First, all hostilities end on both sides. Second, territory will be redistributed fairly. And third, Vasquez must acknowledge the murder of the Sullivan family in Portland 9 years ago and compensate the sole survivor." Salvatore scoffed. "The Sullivan family. This is about that girl, isn't it? You're trading your position as boss for a woman who sells paper flowers. I'm trading a meaningless war so my son can grow up without living in fear," Marco said, locking eyes with Salvatore. "And if you disagree, you can leave this table right now." "You don't have the authority to dismiss me," Salvatore snapped. "I've been consigliere for 30 years. "I do." Marco stepped closer, until only a foot separated them. "You wanted me to become a monster," he said quietly, dangerously. "And I became one. I've killed. I've ordered enemies destroyed without blinking. I've lived by your rules for 10 years. But my son deserves better than that." Marco turned to the other capos. And this family deserves better too. We can't keep living in the dark. Can't keep losing people to endless wars. I'm negotiating with Vasquez. Anyone who supports me stays. Anyone who doesn't can follow Salvatore. The room sank into a taut silence. Then Tony Russo stood and moved to Marco's side. I support you. Another capo rose, then another, and another, until Salvatore stood alone on the far side of the table, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. You'll regret this, Salvatore growled. Maybe, Marco replied, but at least I'll be able to look my son in the eye without shame. Get out, Uncle Salvatore. From now on, you're no longer part of this council. Salvatore scanned the room for allies and found none. He shot Marco one final look, filled with hatred, then stormed out and slammed the door behind him. The meeting concluded an hour later with detailed plans for the negotiation, but Marco didn't stay. He left everything to Tony and drove to the hospital. Matteo was improving. He'd started eating again, though he still spoke little and wouldn't meet Marco's gaze. But when Marco told him he was going to look for Harper, for the first time in weeks, Matteo looked at his father with something other than anger. Really? He asked weakly. Really? Marco nodded. I don't know if she'll come back. That's her choice. But I'll tell her the truth. All of it. And if she chooses not to return, I'll respect that. Matteo was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled from beneath his pillow the crumpled $100 bill he'd kept since the night he first met Harper. Take this with you, he said. Tell her I still have it. I never spent it. Marco took the bill, feeling its weight heavier than any multi-million-dollar contract he'd ever signed. He kissed his son's forehead. I'll bring her back, Marco said. Or at least I'll try. That night, Marco Castellano drove 5 hours from Boston to a small town in Maine. Without guards. Without an entourage. Just him, the road, and the crumpled $100 bill in the pocket over his heart. He wasn't going to propose. He wasn't going to make promises. He was going to tell the truth and let Harper decide. And for the first time in his life, Marco Castellano placed his fate in someone else's hands. The small town in Maine was peaceful, like something out of an old fairy tale. Snow drifted softly over low rooftops, bare trees, and the road leading into the town's central park. It was Christmas night, yet the park lay quiet, lit only by a handful of lanterns casting warm golden halos through the falling snow. There, on an old wooden bench, a woman sat selling paper flowers, just like that first night in Boston. Harper Sullivan wore a worn coat and scuffed boots, a basket of paper flowers at her feet. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, as her fingers folded colored paper with quick, practiced motions. She didn't know whether anyone would come, but she stayed anyway. This was how she lived. This was who she was. A black Mercedes stopped at the edge of the park, far enough away that Harper didn't notice. Marco stepped out, but before he could take another step, the back door flew open and Matteo bolted into the snow. He ran across the white-covered park without a coat or hat and without caring about the biting cold. He had only one purpose: Harper. She lifted her head at the sound of hurried footsteps crunching through snow and froze. Matteo. He crashed into her arms with enough force to nearly knock her off the bench. He clung to her so tightly she could barely breathe, his face buried against her shoulder, his whole body shaking whether from cold or emotion she couldn't tell. Harper wrapped her arms around him as tears spilled freely. My love, she whispered. Why are you here? Why aren't you wearing a coat? What if you get sick? Matteo didn't care about the questions. He pulled back just enough to look at her with tear-soaked eyes and spoke the first words he'd said to her in nearly a month. I kept the $100. I never spent it. Harper stared at him, confused. Matteo pulled from his pocket the crumpled bill Marco had carried all the way from Boston. The same one from the night they first met. The one she'd refused but he'd treasured for months. I didn't take it, he said, his voice trembling. But I kept it. Because that night was when I found you, and I didn't want to forget. Harper felt her heart shatter and mend at the same time. She hugged him again and sobbed silently, while snow continued to fall around them like a protective white curtain. Then she heard other footsteps. Slow. Measured, as if the person were giving her time to decide whether she wanted to look at him or not. She raised her head and saw Marco standing a few steps away, his arms loose at his sides. No attempt in him to appear powerful or in control the way he always did. He simply stood there beneath the falling snow and looked at her with eyes she'd never seen before. The eyes of a man who'd lost everything and was asking for one last chance. He didn't kneel. There were no extravagant promises. No diamond ring, no cinematic proposal, only the truth. I can't change what my world has done to you, Marco said quietly and slowly. I can't bring your family back. I can't erase the 9 years of pain you endured, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure my darkness never touches you again, if you'll allow me. Harper stood with one hand still resting on Mateo's shoulder and studied Marco for a long time. She searched for any hint of deceit or manipulation. She didn't find any. She saw only a man beaten down by life who was trying to stand again, just like her. I don't need your protection, she said evenly and firmly. I've protected myself for 9 years. I don't need your money, your power, or your empire. She glanced down at Mateo, then back at Marco. I need you home for dinner. I need you reading to this boy before bed. I need you there when he wakes from nightmares. I need you to be a father, not a boss. Can you do that? Marco looked at her, then at his son, then back at her. For the first time, he didn't promise something he wasn't sure he could keep. I can try, he said honestly. I don't know if I'll succeed. I've lived in the dark too long. But for Mateo, for you, I'll try every day. Harper studied him another moment. Then she nodded. Then try. Mateo looked from Harper to Marco and back again. So you're coming home with us? Harper smiled and wiped the tears from his cheeks. I'll try, kid. But you have to promise me something. What? You have to eat properly. And you can't end up in the hospital again. You scared me to death. Mateo laughed for the first time in weeks. I promise. They stood there in the snow-filled park. 3 people from 3 different worlds carrying different scars who somehow had found one another. The $100 bill hadn't bought love, but it had opened a door for 3 broken hearts to begin healing. This story reminds us that sometimes the most precious things in life can't be bought with money. Mateo had every material comfort but lacked a mother's love and a father's presence. Harper had nothing but a warm heart and fierce resilience, yet it was her sincerity and unconditional love that changed the lives of the Castellano father and son. Life isn't perfect. Neither are people. Marco made terrible mistakes and caused suffering, whether directly or indirectly. What mattered was that he recognized it and was willing to change. Redemption doesn't come from erasing the past. It comes from building a better future. Sometimes what children need most from their parents isn't wealth or luxury, but presence, shared meals, bedtime stories, and the feeling of being loved and protected. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. Tell us how this story made you feel. Have you ever had a moment when a stranger changed your life? If you were in Harper's place, would you accept becoming Mateo's mother even for one night? We'd love to hear the thoughts from deep in your heart in the comments below, because every story and experience you share is precious and inspires us to keep creating meaningful content. Goodbye and see you in the next video. We wish everyone watching strong health, joyful lives, happy families, and peaceful days ahead. Remember that no matter how hard life becomes, there are always good things waiting in the future. Farewell. Until next time.